Margaret stood alone in the kitchen as evening settled over the quiet suburban house. The kind of house found on calm American streets where every sound feels louder after loss. And as she chopped vegetables, her mind moved faster than her hands. Thinking about Bill's unfinished plans, the silence that had followed her husband's death 3 years earlier. Silence she never fully got used to, because the kitchen used to be the heart of their life, full of laughter, shared meals, and small arguments that always ended in smiles. But now it was just a place where time passed slowly. And that night felt heavier than usual as rain tapped the window and the clock on the wall ticked with a sharp reminder that life was moving on, whether she was ready or not, when suddenly she heard footsteps behind her, not rushed or careless, but careful. Like someone approaching a fragile moment, and before she could turn, her son Daniel spoke her name, in a soft voice that carried more weight than he realized. And she turned with a polite smile she had learned to wear, the kind mothers wear when they want to look strong even when they are tired inside. And Daniel stood there grown now, taller than she remembered, with his father's calm eyes and a serious look that told her this was not a simple visit to the kitchen. And as she asked him what was wrong, she noticed the way his shoulders were tense and his hands stayed in his pockets as if holding back something important. And in that moment, her heart began to beat faster because mothers always sense when something is coming. And Daniel paused, long enough to make the air feel thick, then said quietly that he thought he had seen someone earlier that day. And Margaret laughed lightly at first, assuming he meant a neighbor or an old friend. But when she asked who, his next words made her freeze completely, because he said the name Michael, a name she had not spoken out loud in years. A name she had folded deep into her memory like a letter never sent. And the spoon in her hand stopped moving as the sound of rain faded into the background, replaced by a rush of memories she had tried hard to control. Memories of a different time when she was younger, braver, and still learning how love could shape a life. And she turned slowly to face her son, asking him to repeat himself as if hearing it again would make it less real. But Daniel did not change his words, instead explaining that he had seen Michael at a bookstore downtown, the one near the park, and that he had recognized him from old photos he once found while helping clean the attic. Photos Margaret thought no one remembered, and as Daniel spoke, Margaret felt a mix of shock and fear. Not because of anything bad, but because that part of her life had been closed carefully, like a door she never meant to open again. She sat down at the table without realizing it, her legs suddenly weak, while Daniel kept talking, saying Michael had asked about her politely, asked if she was well, and said nothing more than that. But even those small details were enough to bring the past rushing back, because Michael was not just a memory. He was the man who once knew her dreams before life changed them. The man who loved her before responsibility and timing pulled them in different directions. And Margaret remembered the way she used to believe love alone could fix anything. How wrong and young she had been. And as Daniel watched her closely, she tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that this was just a coincidence, just a name from the past. But her heart did not listen, because it remembered too well the feeling of unfinished goodbyes. And she asked Daniel if Michael had said anything else, hoping the answer would be no, hoping the moment would end quickly. But Daniel said Michael had looked at him with a quiet sadness and said he was glad to know she had built a life and raised a good son. And those words hit Margaret harder than she expected because they carried respect, not regret, and care without demand. And suddenly she felt the years between then and now collapse into a single moment. And she realized how little she had allowed herself to feel since her husband passed. How she had focused only on being strong and steady for Daniel, forgetting that she was still a woman with a heart that could remember. And as she looked at her son, now grown and standing in her kitchen like a bridge between her past and present, she felt something shift inside her. Not hope yet, not fear exactly, but awareness. The understanding that life sometimes circles back in ways no one plans. And as Daniel finished speaking, the kitchen fell silent again. But this time the silence was different, full of questions and emotions Margaret had buried for too long. And she knew without saying it that nothing felt simple anymore, because one quiet sentence from her son had opened a door she thought was locked forever. And as the rain continued outside and the soup cooled on the stove, Margaret realized that the calm evening she expected was gone, replaced by a moment that would change how she looked at her past, her future, and the fragile space between them. Margaret sat at the kitchen table long after the stove was turned off. The room now filled with a quiet tension that refused to leave, and as Daniel stood across from her, she noticed how careful his eyes were, like he was afraid one wrong word might hurt her. But the truth was already moving inside her, stirring emotions she had kept hidden for years. And she asked Daniel to tell her everything slowly, not because she didn't hear him the first time, but because she needed time to adjust to the idea that the past had found its way back into her present. And Daniel explained how he had gone to the bookstore after work, how he noticed a man standing near the history shelf, how something about him felt familiar, and how the moment the man spoke Margaret's name, Daniel knew who he was. And as Daniel described Michael's calm voice and respectful distance, Margaret felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that he had not crossed any lines. Fear because even hearing about him made her heart beat faster, and she leaned back in her chair, staring at the wall where family photos hung, wondering how many times life could change without warning. And Daniel continued, saying Michael had asked if she was healthy, if she was still living in the same house, and when Daniel told him yes, Michael had smiled in a way that felt grateful rather than proud. And those details stayed with Margaret because they showed a man who cared quietly, not someone chasing the past. And she realized that made it harder, not easier, because she could have dismissed him if he had been careless or dramatic. But he wasn't. And as Daniel spoke, Margaret's mind moved quickly through memories she thought had faded, memories of shared dreams, of plans that never happened, of the moment she chose a safer path because it felt right at the time, and she wondered if choosing safety meant giving up something she still carried inside her. And Daniel finally stopped talking, waiting for her response. But Margaret struggled to find words because everything she felt was layered and confusing. And she told him she hadn't expected to hear that name again, that she believed some chapters stayed closed for a reason. And Daniel listened carefully, not interrupting because he wasn't there to push her, only to understand. And she appreciated that more than he knew. And after a pause, she asked if Michael had seemed happy. And Daniel said he looked steady, not sad, not hopeful either, just someone who had lived a full life and learned how to accept time. And that answer settled something in Margaret's chest. Because it meant she wasn't the only one who had moved forward. And yet the connection still existed, quiet but real. And she stood up and walked to the sink, rinsing her hands even though they were already clean, just to have something to do. And Daniel followed her with his eyes, sensing her thoughts were far away. And she finally said that she loved Daniel's father deeply and always would. And that part of her life was not erased by any memory of Michael. And Daniel nodded, understanding more than she expected, and said love didn't disappear just because time passed or choices were made. It simply changed shape, and those words stayed with her because they felt honest and kind. And she realized her son had grown into someone who could see life with emotional balance. And she felt proud and surprised at the same time. And as the conversation continued, Margaret admitted she had locked away many parts of herself after becoming a widow, not out of sadness alone, but out of habit, because being strong felt easier than being open. And Daniel listened without judgment, and he didn't suggest she call Michael or meet him. He simply said that whatever she felt was valid and that she didn't owe anyone silence. And those words lifted a weight she didn't know she was carrying. And she thought about how often women like her were expected to move on quietly, without asking questions or revisiting old emotions. And she wondered if this moment was an invitation, rather than a test. And when Daniel said Michael had left the bookstore after wishing her well, Not asking for her number or trying to reconnect, Margaret felt a strange sense of respect for him because he had left the choice with her. And that made all the difference. And as the evening deepened and the rain slowed, Margaret realized this wasn't about choosing between past and present, but about acknowledging the full story of her life. And she felt a quiet energy inside her. Not excitement, not fear, but awareness. The kind that signals change is possible, and when Daniel finally said he was going to his room, leaving her alone with her thoughts, Margaret stayed in the kitchen, staring at her phone on the counter, not reaching for it, not avoiding it either, simply understanding that the day had shifted something important. And as she turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, she knew that whether or not she ever spoke to Michael again, she could no longer pretend that some parts of her heart were gone, because they were still there, waiting patiently. Just like life often does. Margaret sat alone in the living room later that night. The house quiet except for the low sound of the heater and the distant traffic outside. And even though she tried to focus on the television, her thoughts kept returning to the conversation in the kitchen, to Daniel's calm voice and the way one name had shifted the mood of the entire evening. And she reached for a glass of water only to realize her hands were still slightly unsteady. Not from fear, but from the sudden awareness that something long buried had been brought into the light, and as she stared at the dark window, she noticed her reflection. Older than she remembered, yet still familiar. A woman shaped by love, loss, and responsibility. And she wondered when she had last looked at herself without measuring time by what she owed others. And the thought lingered as she heard footsteps again, slower this time, and Daniel appeared holding an old photo album. The worn cover creased at the edges, and when Margaret saw it, her chest tightened because she knew exactly what it was. A collection of moments from different stages of her life, some joyful, some painful, all real. And Daniel sat across from her, placing the album on the coffee table without opening it, as if giving her the choice. And he spoke carefully, saying he hadn't meant to bring up the past so suddenly, but that seeing Michael had made him realize how little he actually knew about her life before she became his mother. And Margaret listened, surprised by how thoughtful he sounded, and she nodded, understanding that this was not curiosity but care. And Daniel continued, saying that growing up he had always seen her as strong and steady, someone who never asked for anything, and that only recently had he begun to see the quiet loneliness behind her routines. And those words touched her deeply because she had tried so hard to protect him from that part of her life, believing that hiding pain was the same as healing, and she reached for the album. Opening it slowly, and as she turned the pages, memories moved quickly through her mind, moments of youth, laughter, dreams that once felt endless. And Daniel watched her face closely, noticing how her expressions changed with each page. And she told him stories she hadn't shared before. Not in detail, but enough for him to understand that before grief and responsibility, she had been someone full of hope and plans. And Daniel listened with respect, not asking questions that felt too personal. And at one point, he said something that caught her off guard, telling her that he didn't think loving again would erase the love she had for his father. And that love was not a limited thing that ran out, but something that could grow in different ways over time. And Margaret felt tears rise because those words echoed thoughts she had never allowed herself to say out loud. And she admitted that after her husband died, she had promised herself she would never let anyone close again, not because she didn't believe in love, but because she didn't trust herself to survive that kind of loss twice. And Daniel reached across the table, placing his hand over hers, and said gently that avoiding life was not the same as honoring the past, and that her happiness mattered to him more than any rule she had made for herself. And those words stayed with her, settling deep in her heart. And she realized her son was no longer the child she needed to shield from hard truths, but an adult who could offer wisdom in his own quiet way. And as the album lay open between them, Margaret felt a shift inside her, not a decision, not a plan, but a soft opening. The understanding that she had the right to feel, to remember, and even to hope without guilt. And when Daniel finally stood up to go to bed, he paused and told her that whatever she chose to do, she didn't have to do it alone, and that he trusted her judgment completely. And after he left the room, Margaret stayed on the couch, the album still open, her thoughts moving faster now. Not stuck in regret, but moving forward with curiosity. And she thought about Michael again, not as a lost chance, but as a reminder of who she once was. And she wondered if reconnecting with that part of herself was less about romance and more about healing. And as the night deepened, she turned off the lights and sat in the quiet, feeling something new alongside the familiar ache of memory, a gentle sense of permission. As if life itself was telling her that it was okay to step forward again, even if she didn't yet know where the path would lead. The next morning, Margaret woke to sunlight spilling across the kitchen counter. The rain from the previous evening replaced by a soft, clear day that somehow made everything feel sharper and more possible. And she moved automatically through her routine, pouring coffee and arranging breakfast, but her mind was elsewhere, running over the conversation with Daniel and the name that had changed everything. And she realized she hadn't felt this combination of nervousness and curiosity in years. A quiet energy that pushed her to consider choices she had long avoided, and as she sat down with her cup, her phone buzzed on the counter, startling her slightly, and the screen displayed an unknown number, and for a moment she hesitated, unsure if she should answer, her hand hovering over the phone as memories of Michael and the past swirled in her mind, but something inside her told her to pick up, to see where life might be leading, and when she did, his voice came through, calm and steady, unmistakable. The same warmth she remembered, but with a depth that only time could create. And he spoke her name, Margaret, not in a formal or distant way, but gently, as if he had been thinking of her every day for years without interruption. And she felt her heart skip, even though she reminded herself to stay calm, to keep her composure. Yet the emotions were immediate, a mixture of surprise, old affection, and something like hope. And she answered honestly, saying it was not a bad time. Because for the first time she felt ready to hear him, ready to speak without pretending. The past didn't exist, and they began talking carefully. First about simple things, the weather, the neighborhood, her family. And then slowly moving into what had happened over the years, their separate lives. The quiet absence they both felt after going their own ways, and there were no hurried promises. No declarations, just two people reconnecting after decades, sharing memories and perspectives, and realizing how much they had changed yet remained connected at some deep level. And Margaret listened, feeling her chest tighten and release in equal measure. Because the conversation was neither overwhelming nor casual, it was meaningful in a way she hadn't expected. A bridge between past and present, a reminder that some connections never fully disappear. And as Michael spoke about his life, his work, and the moments he had regretted missing, Margaret found herself laughing softly at some stories, remembering how alive he had made her feel, while also acknowledging that their paths had taken them through heartbreak, responsibility, and unexpected turns. And for a brief moment, she allowed herself to imagine what might have been if circumstances had been different. Without guilt, without longing that hurt, but with understanding. And when the call ended, she placed her phone down, her hands trembling slightly from excitement, anticipation, and a quiet relief that no one else could see. And Daniel appeared in the doorway just then, having gotten up earlier than usual. Sensing something had shifted in the house, and he asked if she was okay. And Margaret smiled genuinely, a warmth she hadn't felt in years spreading through her, and told him that she was, that she felt like a new chapter was beginning quietly, without pressure, without expectation, and Daniel nodded, seeing the hope in her eyes, understanding that sometimes life presented opportunities that were subtle but profound, moments that didn't require rushing but simply paying attention. and choosing to embrace them. And Margaret realized that reconnecting with Michael wasn't about rewriting the past or diminishing her love for her late husband, but about acknowledging a part of herself she had never fully let live. A part that could still feel deeply, appreciate love, and experience joy. And she noticed that her heart, long guarded and careful, had begun to expand with possibility, not recklessly, but with the maturity and wisdom gained from years of living fully. And she thought about how life often returned people in moments at the right time. Not because of luck, but because some emotions are persistent and patient, waiting for the right readiness. And as she walked to the window to look out at the street, seeing children playing and neighbors greeting each other, she felt connected to the flow of life again, as if the world outside mirrored the shift inside her. And the quiet thought that lingered was that happiness wasn't something she needed to seek desperately, but something that could come gently, softly, without urgency. And she reflected on Daniel's words from the night before, that she deserved joy and that loving again didn't diminish the past. And she realized how freeing that thought was, a permission to feel fully without guilt or fear. And as she brewed another cup of coffee, Margaret felt a sense of readiness, not to leap into anything blindly, but to move forward with openness, curiosity, and courage. And she acknowledged to herself that life sometimes arrives in the small moments of phone call. A name, a quiet conversation, moments that change everything without grand gestures. And she understood that reconnecting with Michael could be just one of those moments. A soft step towards something meaningful, whether it led to romance, closure, or simply understanding. And as the morning moved into noon, she felt lighter than she had in years. A warmth in her chest that hadn't been there since she had spoken to Michael so many years ago. And she knew that while the past would always be part of her, the present was hers to live fully, to embrace carefully, and to allow love, hope, and connection to re-enter her life at their own pace, and with a gentle smile. She realized that life had quietly given her a second chance not to rewrite her story, but to continue it with honesty, courage, and a heart that had learned the value of patience, reflection, and openness. And she knew that whatever happened next, she was ready to meet it. Because sometimes the past walks softly into the present, and when it does, it can awaken the heart in ways nothing else can.